Through the upheavals and controversies in the Paris Conservatoire, he was the one professor that everyone liked. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Gabriel Fauré. Fauré was born in 1845, and was the only child in a family of 6 to display musicality, playing a harmonium at his school chapel badly but with great zeal. Apparently he was good enough on the instrument to attract the attention of various important people, which led to a domino effect of sorts, and all of which led to the 9-year-old Fauré being enrolled at a just-opened boarding school that had been started by Louis Niedermeyer, which is just one of those great names. The harmonium often stood in for the organ in smaller chapels, and likewise the school that Fauré found himself at was one that was dedicated to the craft of church music. What led Fauré out of just focusing on church music was the influence of Camille Saint-Saëns, who took over when Niedermeyer died. Saint-Saëns was well on his way to becoming the elder statesman of French music, and Fauré, 9 years his junior, looked up to him as, if not a father figure, then certainly something akin to a favorite uncle. This close relationship means that the early arc of Fauré's career can be heavily traced to the influence of Saint-Saëns. After his graduation, he became an organist and a private instructor. The real problem with Fauré's career in the church is that he wasn't like a real super religious person, and he couldn't compartmentalize. The priest at his first church forced him into resignation after he showed up to play mass one day, having not changed or slept from the night before. He partied a little too hard, and it showed. He ended up bouncing around between several different churches because he was still good at his instrument. In fact, he was so good that Saint-Saëns said that he was a world-class organist when he wanted to be. The fact is that Fauré really wasn't interested in the organ nearly as much as he was interested in the piano, and this is laid bare in his collected work, which features much solo piano music against no solo organ music. Fauré's music is just too intimate for the inherent bombast of the organ. After participating in the bloody Franco-Prussian War, Fauré escaped to Switzerland because Paris's streets had just become too violent. What he found in Switzerland was nothing short of his old school, and he taught there for a while under the odd auspices of an educational institution in exile. Of course, it goes without saying that through all of this he composed, but he wasn't really able to crack into the repertoire in any significant way. The great French composers of the previous generation were still going strong, and they had well-established reputations. Because he liked to compartmentalize his life and his music, he wasn't going to let the two interact in any significant way. That is, the moods that he would experience would not be channeled into his pieces. This wound up being a blessing and a curse, but he was also immune to the influence of other composers, such as Richard Wagner. While other composers were grappling with how to write music in the face of this so-called music of the future, Fauré was just simply happy doing his own thing, even if the publications weren't there to show for it. In July 1877, he became engaged to Marianne Viardot, daughter of Pauline Viardot, whose salon he frequented. She broke it off later in the year for reasons we still do not know, but it probably wasn't because Fauré cheated. Now, he had a lot of later indiscretions, but he was apparently so heartbroken about this that saint-Saëns felt the need to take him on a whirlwind tour around Europe just to take his mind off of it. Fauré was known as a preeminent ladies' man who used these salons as a jumping-off point for his, Marriage did come for Fauré in 1883 to Marie Frémier, but he soon came to despise domesticity in all its forms. Their relationship was more like two close friends than an actual marriage, although they did have 2 sons. One of his lady friends during the marriage was Emma Bardac, an actress who is probably best known to music history as the wife of Debussy who didn't try to kill herself. Long story. Also, Fauré probably wasn't the father of her illegitimate daughter, but there was no French Jerry Springer, so I guess we'll never know. If you hadn't figured out at this point, Fauré was considered wildly attractive. Tchaikovsky, in fact, called him, and I quote, adorable. This helped him find mistresses, including a long-term girlfriend for whose apartment he paid. But speaking of money, he was really living paycheck to paycheck. What he got was for his services at the Église de la Madeleine, as well as his customary lesson-giving. His composition life, which had seemed to take an upturn around the same time as his ultimately failed first engagement, also really failed to get off the ground in any significant way. Fauré was perfectly content to write small-scale intimate works. His larger efforts, when completed, often struggled to be performed. His status at the Église de Madeleine did not help. The priest there called his efforts novelties, and he said that the church had no place for them in their repertoire. He also never saw a cent in royalties. Royalties were not standard business practice at the time. Only the real top-notch name-brand artists could really command that. He just simply sold his manuscripts to the publisher, and they gave him a flat fee for it and a one-off payment. All of this led to a clinical depression so deep that his friends checked in on him just to make sure he was doing okay. The aforementioned affair with Emma Bardak helped jolt him out of his funk, in one way or another, and his composition life soon turned around to the point that people, well, knew who he was, at least. The faculty of the bureaucracy-laden Paris Conservatoire absolutely hated the idea of bringing Fauré on as a professor, with their director threatening resignation if the dangerously modern Fauré was so much as considered for a position. Part of Fauré's dangerous modernism was his anticipation of the so-called impressionist composers. He didn't always resolve all of his chords properly for added color and piquancy, and this was considered an absolute no-no. He also liked too many abrupt changes of key, not unlike Franz Schubert, but the difference was that Schubert was dead, at least according to the logic of the Conservatoire. The Conservatoire might have successfully been able to deny Fauré a teaching position, but they did give him a job inspecting the provincial conservatories. But, due to some bafflingly childish political ambitions on the part of the top rungs of the Conservatoire's faculty, Fauré was indeed hired in 1896 to replace Jules Massenet, who resigned because he was denied dictatorial powers over the entire Conservatoire. As composition professor, Fauré was thorough and fair, and it was under his watch that the next generation of great French composers came percolating through, from Maurice Ravel to the Boulanger sisters. His pupils all painted the same picture, that of a kind-hearted fellow who admired the masterpieces and encouraged his pupils to write music that clearly articulated their ideas. He wasn't convinced that his way was the only way, and that really set him apart from his Conservatoire colleagues. Fauré was not enthralled with orchestration and didn't consider it to be the integral part of a composition that it actually is, and this probably stemmed from his discomfort in writing for large ensembles and in larger forms. The things he would orchestrate were to a mixed reception, and when he had to orchestrate something, he occasionally left it to a pupil who was better at it than he. He was inclined to think that the structure of the music overrode, to a certain extent, what instruments it was played on. This shortcoming did not stop him from teaching some of the best orchestrators of the 20th century, which includes Ravel and Lily Boulanger. It was his open-mindedness towards the novel that was considered more dangerously modern than anything he'd written, and Fauré was all but an outcast amongst the Conservatoire faculty. When the Ravel affair broke out into a scandal of significant public outrage, it was Fauré who arguably benefited more than Ravel himself. When the government stepped in to reorganize the woeful Conservatoire, they tapped Fauré to be the leader. Ravel, out of loyalty, had audited Fauré's classes for 3 years after his expulsion from the Conservatoire. As effective czar of the place, Fauré rooted out the teachers who gave preferential treatment to their students in competitions, which led to an atmosphere where students felt like they had to ingratiate themselves with a bunch of different professors just to get ahead in their careers. By appointing independent councils and judges, many of these despotic professors tendered their resignations. Fauré also broadened the theretofore limited scope of the pieces the Conservatoire actually taught. He allowed modern pieces so long as they were part of the repertoire. After all, it would be unfair to their vocal students if they didn't at least become familiar, say, with Wagner's Tristan und Isolde, although that was the one Wagnerian opera that Fauré just could not stand. This entire process, as one would imagine, was a full-time job, and the only time that Fauré had for composition was the summers. However, since he now held a prestigious post in French musical circles, people began noticing his music, at least in France. He had a lot harder time getting his music outside of his homeland, except for England, where he always had a devoted group of fans. While he had drawn the ire of the Conservatoire's old guard, who likened him to Robespierre, he was still a figure who commanded respect because he was just so darn nice to everyone. His other nickname was the Archangel. When Ravel and his circle broke away from Vincent d'Indy, whose views were extremely conservative, Fauré was the only person who could keep the peace or at least act as a mediator. What he cared about was that Ravel's group and Dandy's group were both groups that promoted music, and that's really all he cared about in the end. Even Les Six, who tried to set themselves apart from the rest of French music, respected Fauré, except for their leader, Poulenc, whose music is, ironically, the closest to Fauré's of any of the group. What can we say? Fauré was just the quintessential French gentleman. Fauré eventually retired from the Conservatoire when he was 75 years old due to a bizarre kind of deafness that made things sound out of tune. Lower pitches sounded up to a third lower and higher pitches up to a third higher, and this just encroached on the middle register until he could hear everything distorted and eventually nothing at all. But at this point his fame had been established. In 1922, a national homage was thrown for Fauré, a huge formal black tie occasion where Fauré was hosted by none other than the President of the Republic himself. At this point he was completely deaf, but he sat enraptured by it all, and touched that they'd have an all-Fauré concert where the composer himself couldn't hear a single note. Fauré's last piece was a string quartet, something he wanted to write for years but always continued to put off because he was scared of the specter of Beethoven. He did not want to take on Beethoven's home turf, but time was running out. He completed it through failing health, and he did not like the inevitable Beethovenian comparison just because they both happened to go deaf. People made it anyway, and you gotta presume they have their reasons, but I'm not buying it. He passed away in November 1924, age 79, from pneumonia probably brought on because of his smoking habit. Don't smoke, kids. You might end up a dead French guy. It was out of respect for their former leader that the Conservatoire continued to embrace modernism, but it was through gritted teeth, and after Fauré passed away, they went back to their older, more conservative ways. But the genie was out of the bottle. A Pandora's box of modernism had been opened, and try as they might, the faculty could not put it back. They ignored modernism at the perils of their students. As a pianist and organist who only wrote for the former, and quite extensively I might add, Fauré's music really isn't as idiomatic for the instrument as you would expect. The organ is, and I know this from experience, a very different beast than the piano. You just can't throw a pianist in front of an organist and expect good results to automatically emerge. His music is not written to show off the flashy technical skill of the virtuosi, but rather the accomplished amateur who was versed in the weird, unusual fingerings, familiar to the organ, but often the kinds of stuff that pianists aren't used to and or hate. Again, speaking from personal experience. Fauré's piano music then becomes something of a specialty, something that you only pursue if you're familiar with the quirks of the organ. It is perhaps the most difficult genre if you want to be as satisfying as possible, wrote Fauré about his piano music, and he held a bit of a grudge against the pianists that he felt were ignoring his compositions for their instrument. Fauré's main contribution to written music was in the realm of the French art song, the mélodie. German art song, the lied, was so ingrained in musical culture that it took great effort to save the mélodie from extinction, at least according to Ravel, who was probably looking at his teacher through some rose-colored glasses. What is true is that the mélodies of Fauré are the go-to French art songs of the period. Interest in the voice is near universal in French composition, but Fauré is unique in that his melodies are the only ones to have made it into the repertory in their respective genres. Aside from his often revised requiem, things such as his operas really never made a place for themselves in their repertory. The operas never made it, partially because they were consciously non-Wagnerian and non-extravagant. Critical opinion of them is still mixed. As far as writing for the stage was concerned, he much preferred writing incidental music for plays. Because Fauré's work encompasses everything from the ancient church modes to the barest hints of atonal jazz, all filtered through the grace of turn-of-the-century France, his work is widely seen as timeless. For me, Fauré said, art and music especially consists of raising ourselves as high as possible above that which is.